Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Earlier this week, following the recent meeting between Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen and U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Beijing rehearsed the encirclement of Taiwan during days of military drills. Though China concluded its exercises around Taiwan, tensions in Asia lingers, with Washington staging its largest ever drills with the Philippines and unveiling plans to visit Vietnam. Washington's concerns seem to be growing as China expands its influence over not only Asia, but also Europe and the Middle East as well. How is the U.S. China rivalry going to develop, or is it becoming overblown? For an in-depth analysis, we welcome Professor Choo Jae-woo from Kyung Hee University. Professor Choo, welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Xu Qinduo, Senior Fellow at the Pangoal Institution. Mr. Xu, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first question to our Mr. Xu. A day after Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen returned from her visit to Central America and the United States, Beijing launched 3 days of drills from Saturday, saying the military PLA services simulated joint precision strikes on key targets on Taiwan Island and in the surrounding waters. Could you give us details of how the drills went?
It's a question for me, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm not an, let's say, a military expert. Let me share this with you, my observation. Last year, in the summer, when Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the U.S. House, provocatively visited Taiwan, the Chinese side launched a large-scale military exercise. If you compare this time's exercise with that of last year, you can say for the last time, in terms of the scale and the scope, it's really massive. I think that's meant to send out a message that, a message of a political will and also determination to prepare for the worst, to show that China has a capability, has a political will to protect its interests and to launch this strongest protest against the U.S. intervention or the U.S. support of the separate forces in Taiwan. And now, this time around, I would say this is becoming much more practical. The scale is not as large as last time, but the practicality is of significant increase. It's basically mimic a real scenario, a real situation in a worst scenario that's a conflict, that's a war. I think the message here is clear, that is China is that serious to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's a message for the separate forces inside Taiwan and also to the United States. Probably that's my observation, and in terms of this time around, quite kind of short-lived and also smaller scale military exercise by the Chinese side.
Right, so China is taking this Taiwan issue very seriously right now. Right. Now, Professor Choo, with China having gone so far as to simulate strikes on the island this past weekend, how did the U.S. react to Beijing's move? And adding on to that, the U.S. not only held its largest ever military drills with the Philippines, but also Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to visit Vietnam soon. Could we say those moves are part of Washington's efforts to boost its military presence against China?
Yes, we can look at it from that way, and but also, contrary to last year's American response, when even President Biden says, he's willing to send troops to defend Taiwan, but this time, I don't think we see too much of a response coming from the United States and its government side this year. I think they'd rather take a prudent move on this occasion. When your opponent takes an aggressive action, then you want to step back a little bit and be prudent and be cautious and try to observe what the opponent is taking in action. But at the same time, I think the United States is also making a peripheral strategic movement here by holding exercises with peripheral states of Taiwan, just in case, just like Dr. Xi also pointed out, when the worst comes worse, then, they could get ready and go.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Choo, I'd like to ask you one more question about the impact on Peninsula. U.S. China ties have clearly entered a more dangerous and confrontational era as both of the powers are flexing their military muscles over Taiwan. And experts say if war broke out between the two superpowers over Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, too, could inevitably become a battlefield. What does the scenario look like for South Korea if tensions between the two ratchet up?
Yeah, I think that would be stipulated by some conditions here. I guess one is because there's a ROC-U.S. alliance at work, so just in case American troops are involved in contingency in this region, that would automatically invite South Korea to be part of it and in support of the alliance. That's an inevitable consequences. But at the same time, we could also coordinate our position and our role and functions as to in other ways we can support the United States in action. Action meaning military action in this region. But also another condition would be it would also depend on China. How China perceives, U.S. military forces in Korea, how it's going to perceive the function of the bases, American military bases in Korea, and how it's going to strategically calculate out, to prevent American forces in Korea to make a forward deployment to Taiwan region. So there are many variables here, and it's all going to depend on how these actual actors involved in the contingency will perceive each other and its allies.
Right, see. Now, the tug of war between Beijing and Washington is not just affecting tensions in the peninsula and as well as Asia region, but also the whole world, including Europe. So, Qinduo, French President Emmanuel Macron recently visited China and met Chinese President Xi Jinping. And during an interview on Sunday for a French business daily, he stressed that an escalation over Taiwan was not in the EU's interest and that the EU needs to develop strategic autonomy. Now, what discussions took place during Macron's visit to Beijing, and what does this strategic autonomy mean?
A good question. I think the message from the Chinese side to the French is clear. That is, what are the real causes of the tensions over Taiwan between China and the United States. We know the U.S., just like any other country, like South Korea, like France, like Japan, like all countries in Asia, they all follow this one China principle or one China policy, as the U.S. called it. That is, there's only one China. Before the Tsai Ing-wen government, the Taiwan side would say, it's up to different interpretation. It could be the People's Republic of China, this one China, or a Republic of China, which is in Taiwan. If you look at their claim, they are overlapping. Basically, they say there's only one China. Both the mainland and Taiwan belong to this one China. This could be Republic of China or People's Republic of China. So it's no big deal. They can sit down and talk to each other to see how we can reunify. We are brothers and sisters. We don't need to fight against each other. But when Tsai Ing-wen assumed the office, she took a different approach. She renounced this important consensus, which is called the 1992 consensus. And she basically herself is an independence-minded politician. She encourages steps to basically make Taiwan more independent, keep Taiwan separate from China, with the support from the U.S. Now, here is interesting development, of course. Previously, we know China and the U.S., they have actually, I would say basically maintained peace and stability in this region. in particular related to the Taiwan question, because the U.S. adopted a strategic ambiguity policy. That is, on one hand, they say there's only one China policy. On the other hand, they say, oh, we promised to defend Taiwan, to basically ensure Taiwan is capable of defending itself. So that policy worked pretty well until recently when Donald Trump came to office, and then Biden, because they are increasingly seeing a relationship with China as a competitive one. Instead of engaging China, they adopted new policies like a decoupling, like a containing the rise of China, or a new Cold War against China. Amid this big landscape, I would say, picture of the background, you can see the U.S. is, in the sense, weaponizing the Taiwan question, or using Taiwan as a tool, or the unsinkable aircraft carrier, as called by General MacArthur, many decades ago, against China. I think this period of history probably was shared between President Xi and Macron. So Macron understands this is really about Washington's competition with China. Washington wants to maintain global domination. The rise of China challenged the U.S. position, and this is not a business of the European countries. So French says we should not follow the U.S. blindly and follow the U.S. blindly into a war which has nothing to do with us. So this is basically strategic autonomy for Europeans.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Choo, the posture of individual EU member countries could differ, of course, but many seem to hint that decoupling from China is quite unrealistic. I mean, leaders from Germany and Spain already visited China before Macron, and Italy's leader is also scheduled to meet Xi Jinping early this summer. So to what extent do EU members need China, and what position will EU member states take during this tug of war between Washington and Beijing?
Yes, I think it's not only about EU, member countries, but also, even we have to include, American enterprises here. We've also witnessed that in the same time of, in the same span of time here, we see American companies going into China and try to make some much bigger deals than we expected. And for both parties, they definitely see the economic gains that and benefit that they can get from China, especially, coming this year, they expect, reopening of China is going to help China recover its economy. And if it is the case, then we can recollect a little bit 2 years ago in 2021, when China declared that its victory over COVID back then, and China recorded 8% GDP growth rate, and guess what happened? All these countries that do trade with China, their export and import to and from China has significantly, drastically increased by more than 100%. It was also the case with Korea, with its export has grown by 150%, and its import from China has also increased by 140%. And we see a tremendous economic effect here if China is going to make 5% growth rate, as it had predicted at the National People's Congress in last March. Other than that, I think we can also look at it from a contrary perspective, that is on U.S. policy to China, especially with this effort to, fix the, global supply resilience and its economic policy, towards China, with all these decoupling efforts. And you see all these, bills that the U.S. Congress has passed over the past 2 years. On that perspective, you see a lot of loopholes there, and a lot of bills are so unrealistic, and it doesn't serve the interest of even American companies here. And that's why last March, we have seen executive office coming out and Department of Commerce and Department of Treasury all coming out with an amendment and appendix to already passed bills, and I think that speaks volume.
Right, I see. Now, and China has recently been playing a key role in the Middle East as well. Now, Qinduo, the foreign ministers of Iran and Saudi Arabia met in Beijing in more than 7 years after China successfully brokered a deal to restore relations between these two regional powers. How did China get to play a significant role in this region?
Well, I think it's due to partly due to the fact that China maintained a strong relationship with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. And in that sense, China has this advantage of talking to both countries who are or who have been rivals until recently. That's why you can see China in the first place can play such a role of breaking a deal between the two countries. Secondly, I think Chinese side has tried very hard to persuade both sides basically. Under the so-called global security initiative, that is, of course, a country's national security interest is important. But at the same time, probably you should also take into consideration of the security interests of your neighbors or of another country, so as to make a right decision and to engage with each other on an objective and also equal basis. And this is holistic approach. I think the Chinese has persuaded successfully the Saudis and the Iranians to realize that their real interest is lies in their development. If you want to develop, you need peace and stability, both domestically and externally. For example, Saudi Arabia, they have a goal. They have very important target of called Vision 2030. They want to modernize their country. They want to develop renewable energy, despite being rich in fossil fuels. But they need peace, and they need peace, stability in this region. And also for Iran, they need, a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries will show to the West or to the U.S. that Iran is not really isolated. And also they will reduce the outside pressure on Iran so they can focus more on their own development. China and Iran signed a 25 years cooperation agreement with a lot of Chinese investment in infrastructure and chemicals, etc. But without a peace, and it's difficult to implement those. And China has also one of the biggest player in Saudi Arabia, the largest purchaser of oil and gas from Saudi Arabia, and also one of, I would say, largest investor in Saudi Arabia. So China is in a good position to bring the two countries together, and also under the Chinese concept of creating peace and development. That's the priority, inside China and also around the world.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Choo, China has been flexing its muscles on economic front as well with the introduction of the petrol yuan. I mean, just last month, China conducted the first ever yuan-settled energy deal with Emirati liquefied natural gas. Now, what is the possibility of the petrol yuan system rising to dent the dollar status?
I think it's too early to tell yet because the sample size is too small here. But instead, I think, few samples like that cannot be an indicator yet because, we're talking about daily economic activities here, petroleum and gas, the transaction does not happen on a daily basis between the two countries. And you have to pay the, money in lump sum. And most of the time. So, until, Chinese yuan goes into daily transaction on a regular business deals and on a daily basis, then I think we would have to wait to see, how it's going to advance in the world's market in various domains. And I think it's the beginning. It's a sign that China's Chinese yuan is moving into world financial market on the business front. That's for sure. But how it's going to have an impact on the U.S. dollars as a fixed currency, I think we have still a lot of time to wait.
Right, we'll have to wait and see. Now,
Yes.
Qinduo, as Saudi Arabia moves closer to joining a China-led Asian security and economic bloc, Washington has been alarmed by China's growing role and influence in the Middle East. Should we see these moves as having had an impact on Washington's decreasing influence on the Middle East arena? Or, I mean, is the regional order being reorganized here?
Well, many people are talking about that. I disagree with that perspective because it's based on zero sum. It's like, there's increase of Chinese influence that is achieved at the expense of the U.S. influence. No, the U.S. is still the largest player in the Middle East. Look at their military bases and also military presence in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, for example. U.S. is the biggest player and will remain the biggest player for a long time to come. But I think this rapprochement, this in a sense historic, because it gives people a sense and also a hope that with another big power or a superpower in China coming with this priority of peace and development, it gives people the hope that probably this is the direction for the future development of the entire world. That is, we should focus on development. We should focus on peace instead of conflicts, instead of confrontation and war. And also, I think it gives Washington probably some reckoning. That is, why the U.S. failed to do so. The U.S. has been in this region for decades. What we have seen is, the wars and conflicts, for example, Iraq War, Syrian War, and Libya, Afghanistan, and Yemen war. And there are a lot of tension, a lot of wars and conflicts, but peace hasn't really increased in this region. So, and I think this probably will provide some kind of pressure on Washington. Probably, I would say, if there's a competition between Beijing and Washington, what about competing for making peace rather than making wars? That would be the blessing for the entire world.
Right, I see. I guess I had to remember that this international order is not a zero-sum game. Right, I'd like to ask more questions to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Choo, and of course, Mr. Su, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, this is all time for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.